The palace had been dying for so long that Caliph no longer noticed the silence. She moved through corridors that stretched like frozen rivers of silver and glass, her footsteps absorbed by floors that had once hummed with energy but now lay dormant, their bioluminescent veins dim and fading. 300 years was long enough to forget the sound of voices, long enough that even her own voice had become strange to her, a thing she used only to read aloud from the ancient texts, practicing the old poems as if repetition alone could resurrect her people from whatever void had swallowed them. She paused in the gallery of astronomers, where holographic projections had once displayed the night skies of 1,000 worlds, each constellation mapped and named by Veyral scholars who believed the universe was a book waiting to be read. Now the projectors were dark, their quantum cores exhausted centuries ago. She ran her fingers along the wall, feeling the subtle indentations where controls had been, and wondered, not for the first time, if she was preserving a museum or haunting a tomb. Her ears, longer than any human's and swept back in elegant arcs that nearly touched her shoulders, twitched at a sound that didn't belong. A tremor. Faint, but unmistakable. The palace's gravitational stabilizers were ancient but reliable, designed to hold this impossible structure in the dead space between star systems, where no planet's pull could claim it. She'd checked them just last week, or had it been last month? Time had a way of blurring when you were the only one counting it. Another tremor, stronger now. Caliph moved quickly through the corridors, her long coat trailing behind her like a shadow. She'd sewn it herself from salvaged fabric, stitching together pieces of old uniforms and tapestries, creating something that was neither ceremonial nor practical but somehow both. The palace had climate control in some sections, but others had grown cold over the centuries, their heating elements failing one by one, and she'd learned to dress in layers, to carry her survival with her. The docking bay was on the palace's lower tier, a massive chamber that could have held 50 ships in the days when her people traveled freely between worlds. Now it held only dust and the skeletal remains of 2 Veyral cruisers, their hulls stripped for parts she'd used to keep the palace's essential systems functioning. She reached the observation platform and looked down. A ship had crashed through the bay's atmospheric shield, or what remained of it. The vessel was human-made, she could tell that much from its inelegant design, all hard angles and exposed thrusters, built for function rather than beauty. It lay crumpled against the far wall, smoke rising from its engines, and for a moment Caliph simply stood there, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of it. Nothing had entered this palace in 3 centuries. Nothing living had crossed its threshold since the day she'd woken to find everyone gone, vanished as if they'd simply decided to stop existing. Her hand moved to the blade at her hip, an old ceremonial knife that had become purely practical over the years. She descended the platform's spiral staircase, each step deliberate, her scientist's mind already cataloging possibilities. A derelict ship caught in a gravity eddy. A malfunction that had pulled them off course. Pirates, though what pirates would be doing this far from any trade route, she couldn't imagine. Or perhaps, and this thought came with a flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been fear, they'd come looking for her. For the palace. For the Veyral. The ship's cargo door was open, hanging at an angle that suggested a forced evacuation rather than a controlled exit. She approached carefully, the knife now in her hand, though she wasn't sure what she planned to do with it. The interior was dark, lit only by emergency strips that pulsed a sickly red. She could hear movement deeper inside, voices raised in panic or pain, human voices, speaking a language she recognized from the old databases, though the accent was strange, the words clipped and urgent. Stabilizers are completely fried, Captain, and I'm reading microfractures in the hull. We're breathing recycled air that's 90% prayer at this point. Then pray harder, because I'm not dying in whatever ghost palace we just crashed into. The second voice was closer, moving toward the cargo door, and Caliph stepped back into shadow, watching as a figure emerged into the dim light of the docking bay. Human, male, wearing a flight suit that had seen better decades, his dark hair standing at odd angles as if he'd recently been electrocuted or had given up on grooming entirely. He looked around the bay with an expression that managed to be both wary and deeply unimpressed, which she found strangely offensive. Her palace was a marvel of Veyral engineering, a structure that defied conventional physics, and this human was surveying it like he'd just walked into a particularly disappointing warehouse. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "this is either a rescue or a horror story, and I'm really hoping we're not about to find out which." He patted his jacket, pulled out a small device that she recognized as a primitive scanning tool, and frowned at its readings. "No life signs except us, no power signatures, no, wait." He looked up, looked directly at where she stood in shadow, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd found exactly what he was afraid of finding. "No life signs except us and the one person currently hiding behind that support beam with what I'm guessing is either a weapon or a really aggressive letter opener." Caliph stepped forward, keeping the knife visible but not threatening, and watched his expression shift from cocky wariness to genuine surprise as he took in her appearance. She knew what he was seeing, a woman who looked almost human, dressed in a patchwork of ancient finery, with ears that marked her as something else entirely. "You're either the worst welcoming committee I've ever met," he said, "or the best ghost story. I'm hoping for the former, because I've had a really terrible day and I'm not emotionally prepared for haunting." Eli Thorne had made a career out of bad decisions, but agreeing to transport unmarked cargo through the Persephone drift without asking questions was turning out to be his masterpiece of poor judgment. The cargo had turned out to be experimental navigation cores, illegal, unstable, and apparently determined to rewrite the laws of physics in the most inconvenient way possible. One minute he'd been charting a course around a dead star, the next his ship was tumbling through space like a drunk mathematician's idea of a shortcut, and then he was waking up on a floor that felt too smooth, too cold, with his engineer shouting something about structural integrity from 3 rooms away. He sat up slowly, inventory checking his body parts. Everything seemed attached, which was a pleasant surprise. His head throbbed in a way that suggested he'd met a bulkhead at high velocity, and his shoulder was doing that thing where it pretended everything was fine while secretly plotting revenge. The cargo bay around him was a disaster. Crates had broken open, their contents scattered across the floor like the universe's worst surprise party. One of the navigation cores was sparking in the corner, its casing cracked, which explained the acrid smell and possibly the ringing in his ears. "Mira," he called out, pulling himself upright using a support strut. "Tell me we're somewhere with atmosphere and not, say, the cold vacuum of space where we'll die horribly." "We're somewhere with atmosphere," Myra's voice came back, tinged with the particular brand of stress that meant she was fixing 17 things at once. "Also gravity, which is weird because my instruments say we shouldn't be anywhere near a gravity well. Also we're inside something, Captain, something big and old and I have no idea what." Eli made his way through the ship, stepping over debris and ducking under a ceiling panel that had decided to become a floor accessory. The Wayfarer's gambit had never been pretty. She was a converted mining hauler with delusions of grandeur, but now she looked like she'd been through a blender designed by a sadistic engineer. He found Mira in what used to be the cockpit, surrounded by displays that showed readings so contradictory they might as well have been written in poetry. She was young, barely 25, with the kind of brilliant mind that got bored with legal work and sought excitement in places where excitement usually meant explosions. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, though he noticed she was favoring her left arm. Blood stained her sleeve, but when he opened his mouth to comment, she waved him off. "It's superficial. Unlike our situation, which is deeply, profoundly unsuperficial." She gestured at the main display. "We're inside a structure that's approximately 40 kilometers in diameter, floating in interstellar space with no visible means of support. The architecture reads as artificial, but the materials are nothing I recognize. Some kind of crystalline composite that's both organic and synthetic, which should be impossible, but apparently the universe didn't get that memo. Can we fly out? The engines are dead, the navigation system is having what I can only describe as an existential crisis, and 3 of our 4 thruster arrays are now decorative sculptures. So no, Captain, we cannot fly out. We can, however, sit here and contemplate our life choices until the recycled air runs out, which gives us about 48 hours of contemplation time." Eli looked at the viewport, at the vast chamber beyond that glowed with a faint bioluminescence, like they'd crashed inside the ribcage of some sleeping god. Right. So we explore, find whoever lives here, and politely ask for help. Or we find out why this place is empty and pray that reason isn't contagious. He grabbed a supply pack from the emergency locker, checked that his scanner still worked, it did, barely, and headed for the cargo door. The air outside tasted recycled but breathable, with a faint metallic tang that made him think of old coins and older mistakes. The docking bay, if that's what it was, stretched out like a cathedral built for giants, its ceiling lost in shadows above. Two massive ships sat in the distance, their hulls dark and silent, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This is either an amazing archaeological find, he muttered, or the setup for a very tragic story about a cargo captain who should have stayed in bed. He'd made it maybe 20 meters when he noticed the figure. She was standing near one of the dead ships, perfectly still, watching him with an intensity that made his survival instinct scream. She looked human at first glance, tall, dark-haired, wearing clothes that seemed stitched together from a museum's worth of fabric, but then she moved and he saw her ears, long and swept back, catching the dim light like polished wood. "Hello," he called out, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture for, "Please don't kill me. I'm Captain Eli Thorne of the Wayfarer's Gambit, and I apologize for the dramatic entrance. Our navigation system developed opinions about reality and we ended up here. If this is your home, I'm very sorry about the property damage, and if you could point me toward someone who handles insurance claims or, failing that, spare parts, I would be deeply grateful." She moved closer, and he noticed she was carrying a knife, though she held it like someone who knew exactly how to use it but was choosing not to. Her face was expressionless, her eyes, they were violet, he realized, actually violet, studying him with the kind of clinical detachment that made him feel like a specimen under glass. "You speak the common tongue," she said finally, her voice measured and formal, with an accent that made every word sound like it had been carefully chosen from a dictionary. "That's unexpected. I speak several tongues, actually, though most of them get me into trouble. Common seems safest for first introductions." He lowered his hands slowly. "I'm guessing you're not part of a bustling community here, given the general abandoned palace vibe of the place." "This palace has been empty for 300 years, she said. "I am Caliph, last of the Veyral, and you are the first living thing to enter here since my people disappeared. So you'll forgive me if I'm uncertain whether your arrival is a coincidence or an intrusion." Eli processed this, his mind catching on the phrase, 300 years and deciding it was probably best not to examine that too closely right now. Coincidence, definitely coincidence. Though if we're being honest, it's more of a catastrophe. My ship is held together by optimism and expired warranty agreements, my crew is injured, and I have no idea how to get us out of here. He paused. "But I'm excellent at improvisation and I make a decent cup of coffee, if that counts for anything." For the first time, something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close enough that he felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. "Coffee," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I haven't had coffee in 3 centuries. "Then today is your lucky day, assuming we can find power for a heating element and you're not planning to stab me with that knife." Caliph had forgotten what it felt like to walk beside another person. For 3 centuries, her footsteps had echoed alone through the palace corridors, a rhythm so familiar it had become silence. Now Eli's boots struck the crystalline floors with an irregular cadence, he favored his left leg slightly, she noticed, an old injury perhaps, and the sound was almost violent in its foreignness. She found herself slowing her pace to match his, then speeding up when she realized what she was doing, caught between the muscle memory of solitude and the strange pull of companionship. "So you've been alone here for 300 years, Eli said, his scanner held loosely in one hand while his eyes wandered across the walls with undisguised fascination. "That's either the most impressive commitment to isolation I've ever heard of, or you've got the patience of a saint. I get twitchy after 3 days without conversation." The first century was difficult, she admitted, leading him through an archway that shimmered with residual energy fields. The second was acceptance. The third was simply habit. And now? What's this, the start of the 4th century's comeback tour? She almost smiled at that. Almost. Now I'm trying to determine if your presence here is an anomaly or an omen. The Veyral believed heavily in signs, in the universe speaking through coincidence. I'd moved past such thinking, but your arrival challenges 300 years of silence. They entered what Eli immediately labeled, with characteristic irreverence, as the library that ate common sense. The chamber of archive stretched upward into darkness, its walls lined with data crystals that pulsed with faint amber light, each one containing fragments of Veyral knowledge. Eli whistled low, a sound that bounced through the space like a pebble dropped in still water. This is either worth more than every ship in the galaxy combined, or it's completely worthless because no one can read it. Please tell me you've got a user manual somewhere. The crystals respond to neural interface, Caliph said, moving to one of the access terminals. She pressed her palm against it and the system stirred reluctantly, like a sleeper not quite ready to wake. But the interface requires Veyral biology. I've tried to adapt it for archival purposes, but most of the palace's systems are locked to genetic markers that no longer exist. Except yours. Except mine. Eli set his scanner down and approached the terminal with the careful curiosity of someone who'd learned not to touch things that glowed. So what happened to them? Your people. 300 years is specific. That's not a slow decline, that's an event. The question hung between them, and Caliph felt the weight of it as she always did, a pressure in her chest that had become so constant she'd learned to breathe around it. We called it the Great Silence. One day the palace was full. Scholars, artists, politicians arguing about trade routes and philosophical minutiae. The next morning, I woke and everyone was gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no farewell messages. Just absence, as if they'd all decided to step outside for a moment and forgot to return. That's... Eli paused, and she appreciated that he didn't rush to fill the silence with empty platitudes. That's genuinely horrifying. And you have no idea what caused it. Theories. The crystals contain references to something they were researching, a way to transcend physical form, to exist as pure consciousness distributed across space. But the records are incomplete, and I've spent 3 centuries trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. She pulled her hand from the terminal, and the light faded. Perhaps they succeeded. Perhaps they're out there somewhere, thinking thoughts too vast for neural tissue. Or perhaps they simply died, and I'm the last echo of a species that reached too far. Eli was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, or perhaps they're waiting for someone to figure out the phone number so they can call home. Look, I'm not a scientist. I barely passed remedial physics, but if there's one thing I've learned from hauling cargo across the galaxy, it's that nothing is ever as final as it seems. Lost ships turn up in unexpected orbits, presumed dead colonies send out distress signals 50 years later, and that one time I found a cat living in an asteroid mine that had been abandoned for decades. He caught her look and shrugged. I'm just saying, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Your people might still be out there. The cat, Caliph said. Did it survive? Thrived, actually. Named her Entropy. She lives with a mining foreman on Kepler 442b now, terrorizing his supply of ration bars. He grinned. See? Happy endings exist. She wanted to tell him that a cat was not a civilization, that hope was a luxury she'd used up somewhere in the 2nd century, but something about his stubborn optimism made the words catch in her throat. Instead, she said, I need to see your ship's damage. If I'm to help you repair it, I'll need to understand what we're working with. Generous of you, considering I crashed into your home uninvited. You're the first person I've spoken to in 300 years. I'm not letting you die here out of spite. They made their way back through corridors that Caliph navigated by memory while Eli's scanner chirped periodically, feeding him data about energy signatures and structural composition that he clearly didn't understand but found fascinating anyway. He asked questions constantly, about the palace's construction, about Veyral culture, about whether she'd ever gotten lonely enough to talk to the walls, and she found herself answering, surprised by how easily the words came after centuries of silence. When they reached the docking bay, Mira had managed to extract herself from the ship and was sitting on a cargo crate, her arm properly bandaged now, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and wonder as she stared at the vast space around her. "Captain," she said when she spotted them. "Please tell me you found someone who can help us and not, say, a really elaborate trap." "This is Calith," Eli said. "She's the owner of this establishment and has kindly agreed not to murder us for property damage. Calith, this is Mira Chen, my engineer and the person responsible for keeping the Gambit flying despite my best efforts to crash her into things." Mira stood, wincing slightly, and extended her hand in the human greeting that Calith remembered from old cultural databases. She took it, felt the warmth of skin against her own, and realized with sudden clarity how much she'd missed touch, that simple animal confirmation of another's existence. "The ship," Calith said, looking at the crumpled hull. "I can say." The palace had developed opinions about Eli, or so it seemed to him after 5 days of repairs that kept going sideways in ways that defied mechanical logic. Tools would disappear from where he'd set them down, only to reappear in adjacent rooms. Doors that Calith swore had been sealed for centuries would suddenly open at his approach, revealing chambers filled with equipment he couldn't identify. Lights would flicker on in corridors he was about to enter, as if the building itself was trying to be helpful in the most unsettling way possible. "Your house is haunted," he announced, walking into what Calith called the resonance chamber, where she was attempting to recalibrate a Veyral power cell to interface with human technology. "I'm not saying it's malevolent, but it's definitely watching me, and I'd like it to stop." Calith didn't look up from her work, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface that responded to her touch with cascades of light. "The palace has limited autonomous functions. It's likely reading your biometric signature and attempting to anticipate your needs. Consider it hospitality rather than surveillance. Hospitality would be not moving my wrench to a room 3 corridors away while I'm using it. Perhaps you should keep better track of your tools. Perhaps your haunted palace should respect personal boundaries." She did look up then, and he caught the faint curve of amusement at the corner of her mouth, a rare thing, he'd learned, and all the more valuable for its scarcity. Over the past days, he'd begun to map her expressions like a cartographer charting unexplored territory. The slight narrowing of her eyes when she was concentrating. The way her ears would tilt forward when she was curious. The particular stillness that came over her when she was remembering something painful. "I'll speak to it," she said dryly. "Ask it to be less helpful." "Thank you. I appreciate your intercession with the architectural spirits." Mira appeared in the doorway, carrying a datapad and wearing the expression of someone who just solved a particularly irritating equation. "I think I've figured out why the navigation core went haywire. It wasn't a malfunction, it was responding to a signal. A beacon, maybe, or some kind of homing frequency that pulled us off course." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. "A beacon from where?" "Here," Mira said, stepping into the chamber. "From this palace. It's faint, buried under centuries of background radiation, but it's there. Pulsing on a wavelength that the experimental cores were designed to detect." She looked at Calith. "Has this place been broadcasting?" Calith's hands had gone still over the interface. "No. The communication systems failed decades ago. I've been sending automated messages on standard frequencies, but nothing that would reach beyond local space, and certainly nothing that would interact with human technology." "Maybe not intentionally," Mira said, pulling up readings on her datapad. "But something here is transmitting. Has been for a while, judging by the signal degradation. It's possible the palace's systems activated something when Captain Thorne arrived, or," she paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Or it's been calling out for 300 years and we're just the first ones with the right equipment to hear it." The three of them stood in silence, the implications settling like dust. Eli broke it first, because silence made him nervous and had ever since he'd watched his own ship's crew die in one, suffocating in the black after a reactor breach. So your haunted palace has been screaming into the void for centuries, and my illegal navigation cores decided to answer. That's either the universe's idea of a practical joke or the setup for something significantly worse. We need to find the source, Caliph said, already moving toward the chamber's exit. If the palace is broadcasting, it's using a system I haven't been able to access. Something still connected to the primary power grid. They followed her through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves in Eli's memory. He could have sworn they'd passed that particular intersection twice, but from different angles, until she stopped before a door that looked like all the others but somehow felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. The chamber of reflection, Caliph said, and there was something in her voice that made Eli's instincts prickle with warning. I haven't entered in 70 years. There's nothing inside but the mirror, and it's been dead since the silence. But if the palace is broadcasting, Mira said, and this room is connected to systems you can't access. Caliph placed her palm against the door's sensor plate. Nothing happened. She tried again, pressing harder, and Eli heard her breath catch in frustration. It's locked. It's never been locked before. Let me try, Eli said, stepping forward before he could question the impulse. He pressed his hand against the plate, half expecting nothing, but the door responded immediately, sliding open with a whisper of displaced air that smelled like ozone and time. The chamber beyond was smaller than he'd expected, circular and austere, its walls that same crystalline composite that made up the rest of the palace but somehow more refined, as if this room had been polished by centuries of reverence. In the center stood a mirror, or what had once been a mirror, its frame an elaborate weaving of metal and crystal that seemed to grow organically from the floor. The surface was dark, reflective but empty, showing nothing but the chamber around it. How did you open that? Caliph's voice was carefully controlled, but he heard the tremor underneath. I don't know. I just touched it. She moved past him into the chamber, approaching the mirror with the caution of someone approaching a sleeping predator. This is the mirror of becoming. My people used it to see themselves truly, not the physical form, but the essence beneath. It required connection, understanding, a bond between the viewer and the universe itself. She reached out but stopped short of touching it. It hasn't shown a reflection in 300 years. The elders said a dead mirror reflects a dying species. Eli walked closer, drawn by curiosity and by something else he couldn't name. The mirror's surface was perfectly smooth, darker than glass, darker than water. He could see Caliph reflected in it, and Mira standing in the doorway, and himself, just ordinary reflections in dead glass. Then he blinked, and everything changed. The surface blazed with light, brilliant and sudden, and his reflection wasn't alone anymore. Caliph stood beside him in the mirror, though in reality she was 3 steps away, and their reflected selves were reaching toward each other, hands almost touching. The light intensified, spreading through the mirror's frame like fire through kindling, and he heard Caliph gasp, heard Mira swear in 2 languages. What did you do? Caliph. The palace sang for the first time in 3 centuries, and the sound was not music but something deeper, a vibration that Eli felt in his bones, in his teeth, in the spaces between thoughts. Systems cascaded online throughout the structure, lighting corridors that had been dark since before his grandparents were born, and the air itself seemed to sharpen, to clarify, as if the building had been holding its breath and finally remembered how to exhale. Caliph stood frozen before the mirror, her reflection still reaching toward his, and when she finally spoke her voice was barely audible over the palace's awakening hum. This isn't possible. The mirror requires soul resonance, a connection that exists beyond physical proximity. It was rare even among my people, and across species she stopped, turned to look at him directly rather than through the glass. It's supposed to be impossible. I specialize in impossible, Eli said, trying for levity but hearing how thin it sounded against the weight of whatever was happening around them. Also terrible decisions and crash landings. I'm a man of varied talents. Mira had her scanner out, and the readings were making her swear with increasing creativity. The energy output from this room just spiked by 3,000%. Whatever that mirror is doing, it's pulling power from sources my equipment can't even identify. Captain, I think maybe we should step away from the potentially explosive alien artifact. But Caliph was already moving closer to the mirror, her hand outstretched, and Eli found himself mirroring the gesture without conscious decision. Their fingers met the surface simultaneously, and the world fractured into light and memory and possibilities that tasted like copper and starlight. He saw the Veyral as they had been, thousands of them filling the palace with debate and laughter and the particular chaos of a civilization that believed intelligence was meant to be shared, never hoarded. He saw the Great Silence not as an ending but as a transformation, the Veyral stepping collectively into a state of existence that human language didn't have words for, their consciousness distributed across the quantum foam of reality itself, waiting for something that 300 years later hadn't yet arrived. He saw Caliph alone in the palace, her isolation not chosen but endured, her persistence a monument to love for a people who might no longer exist in any form she could comprehend. He saw his own history reflected back, the cargo ship where he'd lost his first crew, the guilt that drove him to take increasingly reckless jobs, the way he'd turned running into a philosophy because stopping meant remembering. And he saw other things, future things, paths that branched and converged like rivers finding their way to an ocean. Some showed him leaving, the wayfarer's gambit repaired and departing, Caliph returning to her solitude with nothing changed except the confirmation that the universe had moved on without her people. Others showed catastrophe, the mirror's awakening drawing attention from things that should have stayed ignorant of the palace's existence. But one path, thin and bright as a silver thread, showed something different entirely. The vision released them, and they stumbled back from the mirror, both breathing hard. The surface had gone dark again, but not dead. It pulsed now with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, like a beacon. I saw them, Caliph said, her voice shaking. The Veyral. They're not dead, they're distributed, scattered across dimensional boundaries we haven't learned to perceive. They're waiting for, she looked at the mirror, at Eli, understanding dawning across her face. The mirror wasn't just for reflection. It was for connection. A way to find compatible consciousness across space and species, to create bridges where isolation would have meant extinction. A cosmic dating service, Eli said, and when she glared at him he raised his hands defensively. I'm processing existential revelation through humor, it's how I cope. But you're saying your people built this thing to find other species they could connect with, to share knowledge and culture and presumably also really intense philosophy debates. The Veyral believed that intelligence evolved to be collaborative. That consciousness separated by biology was still consciousness, still capable of forming bonds that transcended physical limitation. She touched the mirror's frame gently, reverently. When they transformed, they left the mirrors active, broadcasting across frequencies that most species would never detect. Waiting for someone to answer. Mira had been quiet through all of this, her engineer's mind clearly working through implications. The beacon we detected, it wasn't calling for help. It was calling for connection. And the mirror activated when Captain Thorne touched it because. She trailed off, looking between them. Because apparently the universe has a sense of humor, Eli finished. And decided that a washed-up cargo captain and the last member of an ascended civilization have compatible souls. Which is either beautiful or deeply concerning, and I haven't decided which. Caliph laughed then, sudden and startled, a sound that rang through the chamber like breaking glass. I've spent 300 years alone, convinced I was the last remnant of a dead species, and the universe sends me you, a human who makes terrible jokes and crashed his ship into my home and somehow, impossibly, makes the mirror sing. She shook her head, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since he'd met her. Yes, the universe absolutely has a sense of humor. The palace hummed around them, and Eli felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Mira needed to get home, to report what they'd found, to ensure the crew who'd stayed behind knew they were alive. The Wayfarer's gambit could be repaired now, with the palace's systems active and willing to help. He could leave, resume the life of running and forgetting, let Caliph return to her vigil over a species that no longer needed guarding. Or he could stay. I need to send Mira back, he said slowly. The crew deserves to know we survived, and the Gambit needs proper repairs at a real facility. But the mirror showed me something, a path where this, he gestured at the awakened chamber, at Caliph, at the impossible connection they'd stumbled into, where this matters. Where there are more mirrors, more species waiting for bridges, more of your people's legacy scattered across the galaxy like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. Calipha's ears tilted forward, that gesture of curiosity he'd learned to recognize. You want to find them. The other mirrors. I want to stop running, he said honestly. And if I'm going to stop, I'd rather do it while moving towards something instead of away from everything. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't spend another 3 centuries alone in a palace, even if it is significantly less haunted now. The mirror showed you the same path, Caliph said. It wasn't a question. Among others. Most of them involved me getting into spectacular trouble, which is on brand. But this one felt, he searched for the word. Possible. Like something that could actually become real instead of just another might have been. Mira cleared her throat, and they both turned to find her grinning. So I'm flying the Gambit back alone while you two go on a galaxy-spanning quest to awaken ancient alien artifacts and probably discover the meaning of consciousness itself. I want it noted that I called this, back in the docking bay when we first crashed. I told myself, Mira, the captain is absolutely going to do something monumentally idiotic and life-changing, and here we are. It's a gift, Eli said solemnly. They spent the next week preparing the Gambit enough for Myra's journey home, downloading what data the palace would share, learning the locations of other mirrors from archives that opened to Calipha's touch and, strangely, to Eli's as well. The palace seemed pleased with their decision. If a building could be pleased, its corridors warm and welcoming in ways they hadn't been before. On the day Mira left, Eli stood in the docking bay and watched the Gambit lift off, its engines firing clean and strong, carrying his engineer and his old life back toward human space. Caliph stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and when the ship disappeared into the black she said quietly, I'm frightened. Of what? Of hoping. I'd made peace with endings, with being the last. But this. She gestured at the space around them,